The war had turned the surface of Raxos 7 into a graveyard of steel and flesh. Smoke curled from shattered vehicles, and the thin atmosphere carried the scent of burning fuel and ozone. Captain Elias Voss crouched behind the remnants of a collapsed outpost, gripping his rifle with practiced ease. The battle had been lost hours ago, but command hadn't called a retreat. They never did. The United Terran Defense Force fought until there was nothing left. His squad was gone. Some had fallen under the relentless fire of the Zalthari, others swallowed by the unstable terrain. He had barely survived the last engagement, an explosion hurling him down a ravine, separating him from his men. His helmet visor flickered with damage warnings. His left arm throbbed where shrapnel had sliced through his armor. He was alive, but for how long? The landscape stretched out in jagged rock formations and the twisted remains of war machines. Scanners were offline, but he didn't need them to know the enemy was close. The Zalthari never left survivors. A sound, soft, deliberate, echoed in the distance. Elias tightened his grip on his weapon and turned his head slowly. A figure emerged from the shadows of the wreckage. He was tall, taller than any human Elias had ever seen. His form draped in the tattered remnants of Zalthari combat armor. His exoskeletal plating was dark, ridged with deep scars. The rifle in his clawed hands was lowered, but the tension in his stance suggested it wouldn't take much for that to change. Elias recognized the rank insignia on his chest. A Zalthari commander. High-value target. Their gazes locked. For a long moment, neither moved. Elias' fingers hovered over the trigger. The alien's grip on his weapon tensed. Then, something shifted in the commander's eyes. A flicker of something other than violence. Caution, calculation. Elias felt it too. He could fire, and so could the Zalthari, but both were wounded, both alone. And the battlefield belonged to neither of them anymore. The commander spoke first, his voice a low, guttural rasp. "You are stranded." Elias didn't lower his weapon. "So are you." A pause. Then, slowly, the alien disengaged his rifle's energy cell and set the weapon down between them. It was a silent proposition, a truce in the ruins. Elias didn't trust him. He had seen what Zalthari soldiers did to human prisoners. And yet, the alternative was worse, wandering the battlefield alone until something found him first. He exhaled sharply, then deactivated his rifle and slung it across his back. The tension didn't ease, but something unspoken passed between them, a shared recognition of their circumstances. The Zalthari's mandibles clicked softly. "I am Zarin." Elias hesitated, then nodded once. "Captain Voss." The war had told him everything he needed to know about the Zalthari. Brutal, efficient, merciless. But standing here, face to face with one, that certainty wavered. Zarin wasn't an unthinking killer. He had chosen not to fire. That meant something. The wind howled through the wreckage, carrying the distant thud of heavy artillery. The battle was moving, but not far enough. They needed to get out of here. Zarin gestured toward the horizon. "There is a structure. Not far. We take shelter." Elias could barely make out the faint silhouette of a ruined facility in the distance. If it had supplies, functioning comms, it could be their way out. Or it could be a trap. But what choice did he have? He nodded, and together they moved. The journey was slow. Elias felt the weight of exhaustion settling into his bones. But Zarin moved with steady, deliberate steps. Despite the gash along his side, the alien carried himself with the discipline of a veteran soldier. The silence between them was thick, but Elias wasn't ready to break it. Not yet. He kept his focus on their surroundings, scanning for movement. The Zalthari were known for their tracking abilities. If Zarin's people were looking for him, they wouldn't stop until they found him. They reached the facility just as the sky darkened with smoke from the burning wreckage behind them. The doors had been blown open, the walls scorched from previous fights. Inside, the air was stale, but the structure held. It was enough. Zarin moved first, sweeping the area with quick, precise movements. No immediate threats. Elias followed, scanning for anything useful. He found a half-functional medical station and wordlessly tossed a roll of synth bandages to Zarin. The alien caught it, examined it with a thoughtful tilt of his head, then pressed it to his wound without hesitation. Elias tended to his own injuries, glancing at Zarin between careful movements. The alien's hands were steady, practiced. He had done this before, a warrior who had seen too many battles. Finally, Elias broke the silence. You hesitated before lowering your weapon. Zarin's gaze lifted. So did you. Elias frowned but didn't argue. Zarin tightened the bandages around his torso. This war. Your people think we want conquest. Elias scoffed. And you don't. A long pause. Then, softly, we fight to survive. Elias studied him. There was no deception in his tone, no arrogance. Just truth. It didn't change what had been done, but it complicated things. The silence stretched again. Outside, the distant sounds of war continued. Here, in the ruins, they were caught in something neither had expected. An uneasy, fragile understanding. Elias leaned against the cold metal wall, exhaling slowly. He didn't know what came next. He only knew that, for now, neither of them was pulling the trigger. That was enough. The silence between them had weight. In the dim light of the ruined facility, Elias Voss and Zarin sat on opposite sides of the room, neither speaking, neither trusting enough to rest. Outside, distant explosions rattled the walls, but the battle had shifted further away. They were in a temporary lull, a fragile moment between survival and the inevitable. Elias flexed his fingers, testing the stiffness in his wounded arm. The synth bandages had stopped the worst of the bleeding, but every movement sent a dull throb through his muscles. Zarin, opposite him, adjusted the wrappings around his own torso. His exoskeletal plates were cracked in places, deep gashes running along his ribs. His kind healed fast, but pain lingered in the way he moved. Elias didn't trust easily. The war had taught him that much, but Zarin had not killed him when he had the chance. He had not called for reinforcements, and now they sat here, two soldiers from opposing sides, breathing the same stale air. Zarin's voice was low, deliberate. Your forces will return. Elias nodded. And yours? The alien's mandibles twitched in something close to a frown. Perhaps, if they believe I am still of use. Elias caught the hesitation in his tone. What does that mean? Zarin exhaled slowly, resting his arms over his bent knees. Among my kind, failure is not tolerated. I was given a mission, and I have failed it. His gaze flicked to Elias. That makes me expendable. Elias studied him. So if they find you here with me, they will kill me. Zarin said it plainly, as if it were a fact rather than a possibility. Elias ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. The war had always been painted in black and white. Us versus them. But this was different. He wasn't speaking to some mindless killer, some ruthless conqueror. Zarin had orders just like he did. And now those orders had abandoned them both. The Zalthari commander tilted his head. What of you? Your people will not welcome a soldier who aids the enemy. Elias let out a short, bitter laugh. No, they won't. The weight of it settled between them. Outside, the wind howled through the broken structure, dust swirling in the pale artificial light. Elias let his head rest against the cold metal wall, exhaustion creeping in. He didn't have the energy for another battle, not now. He needed to think. They needed a way off this moon before either side found them. Zarin shifted, his claws tapping against the floor. There is a landing site, 5 kilometers northeast. Elias looked at him sharply. And you're just now mentioning this? Zarin's mandibles twitched. It is not an option I had considered before, because before they had been enemies. The unspoken words hung between them. Elias exhaled, considering. A landing site meant ships. It meant a chance to escape before their respective armies tore through this place looking for bodies. It was a risk, but so was staying here. He met Zarin's gaze. We move at first light. Zarin inclined his head in agreement. Neither of them spoke after that. The night passed in uneasy shifts of watchfulness and broken rest. Elias didn't know when exhaustion finally claimed him, but when he woke, his muscles ached from sleeping against hard metal. Zarin stood by the entrance, his silhouette sharp against the dull glow of distant fires. Elias pushed himself up, shaking off sleep. Time to go. They moved cautiously, sticking to the jagged rock formations that lined the battlefield. The path was treacherous. Uneven ground, craters still smoldering from past bombardments. The air smelled of burnt ozone and charred metal. Zarin was silent, his gaze scanning their surroundings with an experienced eye. Elias followed his lead, watching the way the alien moved, precise, deliberate. They didn't speak much. There was nothing to say. 2 hours in, they spotted movement in the distance. A Terran patrol. 3 soldiers sweeping the wreckage. Elias pressed himself against the rocks, Zarin mirroring his motion. The soldiers were close enough that he could hear their voices through the comlinks. Still no sign of Voss. Command says he went dark near the outpost ruins. Elias clenched his jaw. If they found him, they would assume the worst. If they saw him with Zarin, they wouldn't hesitate. One of the soldiers took a step closer, scanning the area. His rifle was raised. Ready. Elias' grip tightened on his own weapon, but he didn't move. The moment stretched. Then a crackle of static. Squad 6, regroup at Sector 12. No hostiles detected. The soldiers turned, retreating toward the main battlefield. Elias let out a slow breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned to find Zarin watching him. You did not call out to them, Zarin observed. Elias adjusted the strap of his rifle. Neither did you. Zarin's mandibles shifted, but he said nothing. They kept moving. The terrain grew harsher as they neared the landing site. It was an old supply station, mostly abandoned. A single transport ship sat on the platform, its hull covered in dust, its engines powered down. Elias crouched behind the remains of a barricade, surveying the scene. No immediate guards. Either the ship had been left behind in the retreat, or it was bait for a trap. Zarin studied the vessel, his eyes narrowing. We need access codes to override the security. Elias cursed under his breath. Figures. They didn't have time for this. Their presence wouldn't go unnoticed for long. Zarin turned to him. I will handle it. Elias frowned. How? The alien didn't answer. Instead, he stepped out from their cover, walking directly toward the ship. Elias tensed. A lone Zalthari soldier emerged from the shadows near the vessel, his plasma rifle raised. He barked something in his native tongue. Zarin responded, his tone measured, authoritative. The soldier hesitated. Elias watched the exchange, his grip tightening on his weapon. Then the soldier stepped forward, just a fraction too close. Zarin struck like a predator, his movements swift and lethal. Clawed hands twisted, and the soldier crumpled, silent. Zarin retrieved a small device from the fallen soldier's belt and turned back to Elias. Access codes. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Remind me never to play cards with you. Zarin didn't smile, but something flickered in his expression. They reached the ship without further incident. Zarin keyed in the codes, and the ramp hissed open. The inside was dark, the hum of dormant systems filling the air. Elias strapped into the pilot's seat, running diagnostics. Engines are cold. It'll take a minute to power up. Zarin moved to the co-pilot station, fingers gliding over unfamiliar controls. Then we must be quick. A distant noise made Elias freeze. Boots on metal. Someone was coming. Zarin met his gaze, his mandibles tightening. We are out of time. Elias' hands flew over the controls. The ship rumbled to life, engines sputtering as power surged through its systems. Outside, voices shouted. The enemy had found them. Zarin drew his weapon, standing between Elias and the ramp. Get us off the ground. I will handle this. Elias didn't argue. He didn't have time to. The ship's thrusters roared. As it lifted from the ground, gunfire erupted from the landing bay below. Zarin stood firm, plasma fire reflecting off his armor. The ship broke free of the surface, engines blazing. Elias didn't look back. He didn't have to. The ship bucked as it tore through the thin atmosphere of Raxos 7, metal groaning under the strain. Elias gritted his teeth, hands tight on the controls. The engines had barely warmed up before liftoff, and now they sputtered under the sudden demand. Warning lights flickered across the console, but there was no time to acknowledge them. They were airborne. That was the only thing that mattered. Zarin stood beside him, eyes locked on the external sensors. 2 pursuit crafts. Zalthari. Elias didn't need to check the readings to know they were already being hunted. A high-pitched alarm blared, confirming what he already suspected. Lock-on signatures. Figures they wouldn't just let us leave, he muttered, adjusting their trajectory. The ship was fast, but it wasn't a fighter. If the enemy got a clear shot, they wouldn't make it out of orbit. Zarin's mandibles twitched in thought. Evasive maneuvers. Head toward the debris field. Elias didn't argue. He banked the ship hard to the right, angling toward the jagged expanse of shattered vessels floating just outside Vraxos 7's gravity well. Wreckage from previous battles drifted in a chaotic dance, pieces of human and Zalthari warships locked in an eternal, silent struggle. Behind them, plasma fire seared past, missing the hull by meters. Elias cursed under his breath. They were gaining. Zarin's claws moved deftly over the ship's secondary controls, rerouting auxiliary power to the engines. Shields at minimal strength. Hull integrity holding. Great, Elias muttered. Tell me something good. Zarin's gaze flicked to him. We are not dead yet. Elias let out a short, breathless laugh. High standards you've got. The first enemy fighter maneuvered through the debris with practiced ease, its sleek frame weaving between the broken remains of ships. The second held back, circling like a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. Elias clenched his jaw. They wouldn't outrun them. He needed another option. Zarin studied the readings, his expression unreadable. There is a derelict Zalthari warship ahead. Its reactor core remains active. Elias followed his gaze to the twisted remains of a battle cruiser. A dead husk drifting through space, its insides nothing but wreckage and ghosts. But if its reactor was still active, a plan formed. Reckless, dangerous, stupid, his kind of plan. Elias adjusted their course, diving toward the wreckage. Zarin stiffened. You intend to use the ship's radiation to mask our signal. Exactly. Elias pushed the engines harder. But we need to get close. Real close. The first enemy fighter followed, closing the gap. The second maintained its distance. It knew. Zarin's voice was calm. They will not follow us inside. The radiation levels are unstable. Elias smirked. That's the point. The dead warship loomed ahead, its broken hull a maze of jagged metal and collapsed corridors. Elias angled their ship through a narrow opening in the side, scraping against debris as he forced the vessel into the wreck's hollow remains. An alert flared, radiation levels spiking. Behind them, the pursuing fighter hesitated. Then, as expected, it pulled back, unwilling to risk contamination. Elias exhaled, easing the ship deeper into the wreckage. The fighter drifted outside, waiting. They weren't safe. Not yet. Zarin studied the readings. Radiation levels will interfere with their scanners, but they will not leave. They will wait for us to emerge. Elias knew he was right. They were trapped. A slow, dangerous idea took root. He turned to Zarin. That reactor core. Still unstable? Zarin's mandibles tightened in understanding. Yes. Elias nodded. Then we make it their problem. Zarin didn't hesitate. He moved to the ship's control panel, accessing external systems. If I can trigger a cascade failure in the reactor, it will force them to retreat. Or, Elias said, it'll kill us. Zarin met his gaze. We are out of options. Elias sighed. Fine, but make it quick. Zarin's claws danced over the interface, inputting commands with the efficiency of someone who knew his own people's technology inside and out. Moments later, a warning pulsed across the external sensors. The reactor core was destabilizing. Outside, the enemy ships detected it too. The first fighter pulled back, alarms flashing across its own system as it calculated the threat. The second hesitated for only a moment before breaking off. Elias watched the readings. "Come on, go." The first fighter hesitated a fraction too long. Then the warship's reactor ruptured. A shockwave burst outward, ripping through the wreckage in a silent explosion of energy and debris. The first fighter was caught in the blast, its hull splitting apart before it could escape. The second had seen it coming, it had fled just in time. The comms crackled to life, an angry voice barking orders in Zalthari. Zarin stiffened, mandibles pressing together. "They know I am with you," he said, his voice quiet. Elias didn't need a translation to understand. Zarin had just declared himself a traitor. For a long moment, neither spoke. The ship drifted in the debris field, the only sound the hum of the barely functioning engines. Elias finally broke the silence. "We need a place to land. Somewhere they won't find us." Zarin studied the star maps. "There is a moon near the outer rim, uninhabited. They will not think to search there immediately." Elias didn't argue. He set the coordinates, guiding the ship toward the void beyond the battlefield. The journey would be long, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they were out of immediate danger. Elias leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You didn't have to do that." Zarin turned his gaze to him, unreadable. "Yes, I did." Elias held his stare, something unspoken passing between them. "Trust." The ship carried them into the darkness, away from the war, away from everything they had known. For now, the stolen ship drifted in the endless dark, its engines humming at low power. The moon they had chosen for refuge was a barren husk, pockmarked with craters and veined with jagged canyons. It had no atmosphere, no life, just silence. It was perfect. The Zalthari would search the established routes, the trade lanes, the border planets. Here, in the dead quiet of forgotten space, they had a chance to disappear. Elias sat in the pilot's chair, his fingers drumming against the worn metal armrest. His body ached from the crash, if he could call it that. A rough landing, controlled enough to keep them alive but violent enough to leave the ship damaged beyond quick repair. They weren't going anywhere anytime soon. Zarin stood near the viewport, his posture rigid, his gaze distant. His mandibles twitched slightly, the only sign of the thoughts turning in his mind. He had barely spoken since the reactor explosion, since the moment he had sealed his own fate by siding with Elias. Elias finally broke the silence. "They won't stop looking for us." Zarin didn't turn. "No." A beat of quiet stretched between them. Elias sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "You made your choice back there. You didn't have to." Zarin's head tilted slightly, his golden eyes reflecting the faint glow of the control panels. "Neither did you." Elias scoffed. "I was already a dead man the moment my squad got wiped out. You had a future." Zarin turned now, stepping toward him with measured precision. "You believe that is all that defines me? Orders? A role dictated by war." His voice was low, steady, but there was something else beneath it. Frustration. Conviction. "I have spilled blood for my people, just as you have for yours. I have followed commands that led to victory, to loss, to nothing. But when I stood in that wreckage with you, I saw something I have not seen in years." Elias felt his breath slow, caught in the weight of Zarin's gaze. "And what was that?" Zarin hesitated, as if searching for the words in a language that had never been meant for this. "A reason." Elias stared at him. "A reason. Not survival. Not duty. A reason." For a long time he had fought because there was nothing else. Because the war had taken everything before he even had a chance to know what he wanted. But here, in this moment, stripped of their ranks, their orders, their people, he understood. He stood, closing the distance between them, the stale air between them charged with something unsaid, something inevitable. Zarin did not move away. A sound shattered the moment. A sharp, electric crackle through the comm system. Elias turned sharply, his pulse spiking. He exchanged a glance with Zarin before moving to the panel, fingers flying over the controls. The long-range scanner had been off to avoid detection, but now it flickered to life, displaying a proximity alert. Zarin stepped forward. They found us. Elias clenched his jaw. Not just them. The scanner showed multiple signals approaching from different directions. Human and Zalthari ships. He swore under his breath. They weren't just being hunted by one side anymore. Whatever had happened back there, whatever reports had been sent, it had spread. His own people wanted him dead just as much as Zarin's did. Zarin's mandibles tightened. We cannot fight them. Elias slammed his hand against the console. I know. The ship was barely holding together. They had no weapons that could match an incoming fleet. No allies. No escape. The comms crackled again, but this time, a voice came through. *** Elias Voss. Zarin of the Zalthari. You are ordered to surrender immediately. ***. The transmission was open channel, a joint command. Both sides working together to wipe them out. Elias let out a bitter laugh. Well, isn't that something? Zarin's gaze flicked to the viewport. The distant glow of approaching ships burned against the void, getting closer with each passing second. They are giving us an option, Zarin said, but there was no real belief in it. Elias exhaled, running a hand through his hair. They'll kill us the moment we surrender. Zarin nodded. Then we do not. Elias stared at him, then at the controls, then at the broken, lifeless landscape outside. If they left this ship, they wouldn't last long in the open. But staying here meant being annihilated in the crossfire of two armies that would rather erase them than acknowledge them. Unless a reckless, desperate idea formed in his mind. A move so suicidal that it might be the only one that worked. He turned to Zarin. There's an emergency thruster burst left in the ship. Not enough to get us into orbit, but enough to send us deep into the canyon system outside. He gestured toward the viewport, where a web of cragged rock stretched for miles. We disappear into the caves. Let them waste time tearing this ship apart while we slip away. Zarin considered it, his golden eyes scanning the canyon formations below. His mandibles shifted in thought. It is possible. He met Elias' gaze. But it will be dangerous. Elias smirked. Yeah, I figured. Zarin didn't argue. He moved to the controls, fingers adjusting sequences with sharp precision. Once we are inside the canyons, the interference from the mineral deposits will disrupt their scanners. It will not last long, but it will give us time. Elias took his position at the thruster controls. The incoming ships were almost within range. They had seconds before the first shots would be fired. He glanced at Zarin. On my mark. Zarin nodded. Elias exhaled. Now. He slammed the thruster override. The ship lurched violently, engines roaring in protest as the last reserves of power burst to life. The vessel pitched forward, diving toward the surface, straight toward the canyons. Behind them, the comms exploded with frantic transmissions. The first wave of enemy fire streaked past, but they were already moving too fast, too erratic. The ship spiraled downward, slipping just beneath the first barrage. Zarin braced himself against the console, voice sharp. Brace for impact. Elias gritted his teeth. I am bracing. The canyon walls rushed toward them, and then, impact. Metal screamed as the ship scraped against rock, tearing into the canyon floor in a violent, grinding halt. The force threw Elias forward, his harness digging into his chest. Sparks burst from the control panels. For a moment, there was only darkness and the deafening roar of destruction. Then silence. Elias groaned, forcing his eyes open. The ship was wrecked. Smoke filled the cabin. Zarin was already moving, shaking off debris, his golden eyes sharp with urgency. We must go. Now. Elias coughed, unstrapping himself. Pain shot through his ribs, but he pushed forward. There was no time. Together, they forced the hatch open, stepping onto the rocky terrain. Above them, the sky was alight with fire. The enemy ships were closing in, circling like vultures. Elias turned to Zarin. We run. Zarin nodded once. We run. Then, Without another word, they disappeared into the canyons, leaving behind the wreckage of everything they had once been.